Metal casting has always been at the forefront of human innovation. By pouring molten metal into sand molds, we are able to fabricate complicated and durable products. In the 1920s, Ford and other industrial giants developed efficient processes that allowed the mass production of stoves, pipes, sinks, iceboxes, and countless other household items. First, it is important to familiarize yourself with your work area. Make sure you have a flat surface to make your cast on. This is the kiln. It heats your metal and will be heated up to 1300 degrees. The front hatch allows us to look inside, and the main door gives us access to the heating chamber. Now, let's prepare the kiln. We will be using aluminum for our pour today. Take the ceramic crucible and fill it with multiple aluminum ingots. It's best to get in the habit of holding the crucible with tongs, as it will be scalding hot soon. Place the crucible in the kiln. Make sure to securely close the kiln's door. On the control panel, press Recall, Enter, Start. Now, the kiln will begin to heat itself at a pre-programmed rate. Next, we have to make the cast. The cast is the sand molding that will shape the molten metal into our desired pattern. Today, we will be using this starfish as our pattern. Let's move over to our flat workspace and begin working with the sand. Take two wooden blocks and place them parallel to each other. Place the pattern on the blocks, with the protruding side up. We can now take a metal flask with guiding pins and slide it into place on the pattern. The flask is what holds the sand's shape. Whoa there, we aren't ready for sand yet. We first need to sprinkle the releasing agent over the pattern so the sand doesn't stick. Now, we are ready for sand. It's important that the first layer of sand be granular so we can reach all of the details of the pattern. We use the sifter like a cheese grater to lay a thin and consistent coat. Keep sifting till the pattern is covered. Now, we need to pack the sand down to remove the trapped air. Gently tap the surface of the sand, making sure to only apply downward force. While raising your fingers, be careful not to shift the mold, as the sand tries to stick to you. With the sand packed down, we have revealed some of the pattern. Don't worry, just repeat the process of laying the sand and packing it down till it is covered. Nice work. Now we can be more careless with the placement of the sand. Take a handful and break it up into smaller chunks as you drop them into the flask. Be careful not to disturb the first layer. With the flask half full, you can now compact it again to remove the air. You can apply more pressure than you did the last time. Continue to add sand till the flask is overflowing. Make sure to compact it with a good deal of force to ensure the cast strength. Now take a flat rod and place it flat on the corner of the flask. Slowly saw away the excess sand, making sure to keep the rod flat against the sides of the flask. If there are any significant imperfections in this surface, fill them with sand and flatten them with the rod. Perfect. Now let's clean our workspace before we move on. Use the small brush to gather the leftover sand. Put the sand back into the container to use later. Good job. An organized desk is an organized mind. We now have to flip this side of our cast over to make the other side. Lift the cast from the sides of the pattern plate. Move the wood blocks out of the way. Flipping the cast can be frightening, but all it takes is a steady motion while gripping both the pattern plate and the flask from the sides. Take the flask with the guiding holes and slide it onto the other flask's guiding pins. sprinkle the release agent onto the plate as we did before. Before we make this side of the cast, it's best we go over the anatomy of a proper cast. This diagram depicts both sides of our cast, the bottom being the side we just made. When we pour our molten metal into our cast, we need to provide a cup where the metal can fill before continuing to the rest of the path. The metal falls into the cast through a hole called a sprue. Once the metal is ready to enter the cavity of our pattern, it must first run through a runner which leads to the side of the cavity. As the metal fills our cast, it forces the air out and takes its place. The air is able to exit the cast through the riser and out the vent. The overflowing metal flows up the riser until it eventually hardens. Prior to filling this side of the cast with sand, we must add rods to form the sprue and riser. Here, you can use pens, screwdrivers, or other lightweight rods. Place a rod on the marking on the back of the plate. Surround the base of the rod with sand until it has enough support to stand on its own. Repeat for the other rod. With the rods in place, we can now fill the flask, as we did before. Add and pack fine sand, followed by more heavily packed layers. Be careful not to shift the rods in this process. Finally, wipe the top of the flask to make it flat. This side does not need to be a perfect surface, however. Take a moment to visualize the pattern plate. Recall that this side is the side with the sprue, indicated by the runner on the pattern, and by nature, the other side holds the riser. At the entry point of the sprue, we must add a cup. Surround the sprue rod with sand to form a bowl. We can now remove the rods to expose the sprue, riser, and vent. The final step in the cast making process is removing the pattern plate from between the two flasks. Lift the plate and top flask straight up. You can now see the cavity of our pattern. Set down the pattern plate off to the side while still gripping the flask. Return the flask through the guiding pins onto the other flask. Our cast is now complete. From the sound of it, the kiln has reached the required temperature. We still have to wait half an hour to let all the aluminum melt. That gives us enough time to gear up for a safe pour. First, make sure to be wearing closed-toed shoes, as well as strap-on foot coverings. These are precautions for the unlikely event of a molten metal spill. Next, put on flame-resistant sleeves, which will protect your arms from the extreme heat of the kiln and crucible. Put on a non-flammable apron to protect your body from unwanted metal splashes. The most important safety equipment of all are flame-resistant gloves. Lastly, wear goggles, along with a protective face shield. Nice work, you're looking safe and sharp. Finally, it is time to pour the metal. Your metal is fully melted and has reached a very hazardous state. You first need to set up your workspace and rehearse the pour. Place the circular tong onto your pan. Once you open the kiln door, you will grab the crucible with your tongs and place it in the circular tong. You will then pick up the crucible with the tong and use a metal rod to remove any floating debris in the crucible. Set the rod down and move the crucible above the pouring cup. Slowly pour the metal into the middle of the cup, making sure it doesn't overflow. Lastly, set the crucible onto the pan. Now you're ready for the real thing. Make sure to move slow, stay alert, and be safe. Nice work. Pick up the crucible with your tongs and place it back into the kiln. We have to anneal the crucible to let it slowly cool down. On the control panel, press Anneal Now. Let your pour sit for a couple minutes to cool down. Keep your gloves on and peel some of the pouring cup away to reveal the hardened aluminum. Use your tongs to loosen and lift the aluminum part out of the cast. That starfish is looking rather dapper. Don't let him get away now. Pick it up with the tong and bring it to a nearby sink or water bucket to cool it down. After leaving it for a couple minutes, it should be cool enough to touch. For cleanup, the majority of the sand is reusable. However, the sand that was in contact with the molten metal can burn and lose its molding properties. The sand is an insulator, so it remains very hot long after the pour. So use tongs to gather the charred sand and separate it from the rest. You can separate the two flasks to easily access all of the sand. After salvaging all of the untouched sand, throw away the rest and leave your work area better than you found it. To finish your part, clamp it down. Cut at the line where the runner meets your part using a hacksaw. Also, cut off the remains of the riser on the back of your part. Head over to an aluminum belt sander to remove leftover imperfections and smooth the edges. The excess aluminum that you cut from your part can be saved for later aluminum pours. Amazing work! Your starfish is looking rather dapper. You are now trained to carry out basic metal casting and foundry operations. I wish you well on your safe ventures into the wondrous world of metal casting.